The Arizona wind has a voice, and on some nights it howls about the dead. For a woman all alone in a cabin, miles from anything that calls itself a town, that voice can sound like a memory you've been trying to bury, or a warning you're about to need. Tonight that wind wasn't whispering. It was screaming. It clawed at the roof and shook the bones of the little homestead, trying to rip it right out of the stubborn earth. Inside, a single lantern burned. A tiny gold fist punched against an ocean of darkness. This isn't just a story about a storm or a woman waiting it out with a gun on the table. It's about what happens when the door you've locked against the world is rattled by a stranger. And the man who falls through that door is 100 times more dangerous than the tempest you were hiding from. The year was 1878, and the ground in the Arizona Territory was still thirsty for blood. For Josephine Adler, the silence her husband Thomas left behind 6 months ago was a living thing, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. He'd been a good man, a strong man. He saw a future in this patch of dirt at the foot of the Dragoon Mountains where everyone else just saw rock and thorn. But Thomas was gone now, and the future he saw was just an endless, aching quiet for Josephine. Tonight, though, the quiet was gone. The storm was a monster, hammering the log cabin Thomas had built with his own 2 hands. Every gust that shrieked down the chimney sounded like a lost soul. Josephine sat at the rough-hewn table. Her husband's Colt Peacemaker was lying next to a half-empty cup of chicory coffee, oiled and ready. She wasn't a scared woman. This land didn't give you the luxury of fear. But she was tired, so deeply tired. And the world outside her door was filled with men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity, or a problem to be removed. She was tracing the grain of the wood with one finger when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. This was sharp, deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. A human fist against the heavy oak door. Josephine's heart felt like it stopped beating. No one came out this far. Not in a storm that was trying to tear the sky in half. The closest town, Purgatory Creek, was a half-day's ride, and the folks there weren't exactly neighborly. Her hand, almost without thinking, wrapped around the checkered grip of the Colt. She stood up slow, the scrape of her chair swallowed by the gale. "Who's out there?" she called out, her voice tight, but it didn't shake. The only answer was a groan, a low, ragged sound nearly stolen by the wind. It was the sound of pure agony. Her mind raced. It had to be a trick. Jedediah Cain's men had been circling her property for weeks, like vultures waiting for something to die. Cain was a cattle baron with a soul as dry and cracked as the alkali flats he ran his herds on. He wanted her land. He claimed Thomas owed him money, a lie so thin you could see the sun through it, but a useful one. His foreman, a brute named Silas, had made it plain they wouldn't take no for an answer forever. Thump. Weaker this time, followed by the unmistakable slump of a body sliding down the outside of her door. Josephine was torn. Her common sense screamed at her to leave it be. But her compassion, the part of her that was still human, fought back. To leave a man to die in this storm, trick or not, felt like a sin. Thomas wouldn't have let a dog die out there on a night like this. Taking a deep breath, she moved the lantern to a hook by the door. She lifted the heavy bar, the wood smooth under her trembling hands. Then she cocked the hammer on the Colt. The click was the loudest sound in the world. She pulled the door inward, just an inch, just enough to see. He didn't walk in. He fell. A heap of wet buckskin and tangled black hair, collapsing onto her floorboards in a puddle of rainwater and mud. Her blood went ice cold. He wasn't one of Cain's men. He was an Apache. The stories they told in town whispered through her mind. Raids, vengeance, blood for blood. To the settlers, any Apache was a loaded gun with the hammer pulled back. This one was tall, built like a mountain cat, but his strength was failing fast. His face, all sharp angles and fierce pride, was pale under the streaks of rain and dirt. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the left side of his deerskin shirt, just below his ribs. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his black eyes finding hers in the lantern light. They were burning with a feverish intensity, but they were clear, so clear. He didn't even glance at the gun in her hand. He looked right at her, like he was seeing straight through to her soul, weighing it, judging it. For a long second they just stared at each other, A lone white woman, a wounded Apache warrior, the whole bloody history of the West, framed in her doorway while a storm raged around them. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry, rattling cough that shook his whole body. Every instinct Josephine had screamed at her. Slam the door. Bar it. Put a chair under the handle and wait for the sun. But the sight of the blood, so dark and so much of it, and the raw human pain on his face, it broke through the fear. She lowered the Colt, just a fraction. "You're bleeding bad," she said. The words were clipped, practical. He just nodded, his gaze never leaving her. He was dying. They both knew it. Before she could think about it, before she could change her mind, she kicked the door shut against the howling wind and slid the heavy bar back into place. The cold metal of the peacemaker was forgotten on the table as she knelt beside him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Grunting with the effort, she managed to drag him closer to the hearth, where the embers of the fire still glowed. The cabin filled with the smell of wet leather, rain, and blood. It was the smell of violence, the smell of survival. She grabbed her sewing basket. It was also her medical kit. Clean rags, a bottle of carbolic acid, a needle, and gut thread. Thomas had taught her how to stitch up a wound, on cattle and on men. But this was different. "I need to get that shirt off," she mumbled, more to herself than to him. He watched her with those dark, unblinking eyes as she took her sharpest knife and carefully cut the buckskin away from the wound. What she saw underneath made her stomach turn over. It was a bullet hole, ragged and angry. The bullet was still in there. It had gone in low on his side. It hadn't killed him instantly, but he was bleeding out, and fast. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice finding its authority again. "This is going to hurt." He gave a small, almost invisible nod, his jaw set like stone. She poured her last bottle of whiskey into a bowl. The good whiskey she saved for nights when the memory of Thomas was just too much, and cleaned the wound as best she could. He didn't flinch. He didn't make a sound, but she saw the cords in his neck stand out like ropes. His control was terrifying. Probing for the bullet was the worst part. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The man's breathing was shallow. His whole body was tense as a drawn bowstring. Then she felt it. The forceps closed around the lump of lead. She pulled. With a sickening little squelch, the bullet came free. He let out a sharp hiss of breath through his teeth. It was the first sound of pain he'd allowed himself. She worked fast now, packing the wound with yarrow leaves to slow the bleeding and stitching the flesh back together with neat, tight sutures. She bandaged him with strips of cloth torn from one of Thomas's old shirts. He never lost consciousness. His eyes followed her every move. When she finally sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands were slick with his blood. The storm was quieting outside, but inside the cabin, the tension had a new, sharp edge. He finally spoke. His voice was a low rasp. "My thanks." His English was clear, better than she expected. She just nodded, too tired to speak. The hours bled together. She helped him drink some water, then some thin broth. He was weak, but the fever in his eyes was starting to fade, replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence that was almost as unnerving as the pain had been. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, Josephine knew she had to sleep. She looked from the wounded man on the pallet by her fire to her own bed in the corner. There was no way. I'll be in the stable," she said, grabbing a spare blanket. "The roof leaks, but it's dry enough in the loft." She expected him to nod, to be grateful. Instead, his eyes went hard. He pushed himself up, a move that must have sent fire through his side. "No." The word was quiet, but it hit the air like a hammer. Josephine stopped, her hand on the door latch. "I beg your pardon?" "You will not sleep in the stable," he said, his voice stronger now, laced with an authority that shocked her. He gestured with his chin toward her bed. "You will sleep there." A hot flare of indignation shot through her. Who was this man? This stranger, this Apache she'd just pulled from death's door, to tell her where to sleep in her own home? "I'm not about to share a room with—" She couldn't say the words. A man, a stranger, an Apache. He seemed to read her mind. "The coyotes are circling," he said, his voice low and serious. "The storm washed away the scent of your husband's iron and smoke. This cabin now smells of a lone woman and fresh blood. It is a beacon." "I have my gun," she said, her chin jutting out. "I can take care of myself." His gaze was flat, unimpressed. "You cannot hear a man approach in a dying wind? You cannot smell a rifle until the powder is lit? Your gun is useless if you are asleep in a barn, while a knife is at your throat." He paused, letting the silence hang between them. His next words were quiet, deliberate, and absolute. "You will sleep where I can hear you breathe, or you will not sleep at all." It wasn't a threat. It was a warrior's cold, brutal logic. He was offering her protection, but on his terms. He was too weak to stand guard, but his senses were his only weapons. By keeping her close, he could protect them both. The small space of her cabin was the only battlefield he could defend. She stood there, frozen. To be safe from the men outside, she had to trust the man inside. The man her whole world had taught her to fear. He was a shield that felt as dangerous as a sword. Slowly, deliberately, she let go of the door latch. She walked back into the room and laid her blanket down on the floor, on the other side of the hearth from him. A compromise. A statement. He watched her, and for the first time, a flicker of something that looked like respect softened his face. He gave a single slow nod and lay back down, his eyes closing. Josephine sat on her makeshift bed, the Colt peacemaker in her lap, and listened to the steady breathing of the wounded Apache as the sun came up over a world that had changed forever. The daylight was gray and unforgiving. It showed the chaos of the night. Muddy footprints, blood-stained rags, and the faint, coppery smell of the warrior's wound still hanging in the air. Josephine was bone-tired. She'd spent the night in a state of hypervigilance, dozing in short, dreamless bursts. The Apache slept. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face softened, and she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. But even unconscious, he looked like a coiled spring, a predator at rest. She learned his name was Dakota. He offered it in the pre-dawn quiet. A simple fact, not an offer of friendship. He said he was Chiricahua. She was outside checking on her chickens, her breath misting in the cool morning air, when she saw them. 3 riders, dark shapes against the pale sky, picking their way through the mud. Her heart plunged. It was Jedediah Kane, with his foreman, Silas, and another hired gun beside him. She sprinted back inside, her mind racing. "Riders!" she hissed, ramming the bar across the door. Dakota was awake in an instant. The change was startling. One moment, he was asleep. The next, his eyes were open, sharp and clear, all weakness gone. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his face a mask of pain he refused to acknowledge. "How many?" he asked, his voice low. "3. It's Kane." A look of dark understanding crossed Dakota's face. He knew the name. Kane's reputation for cruelty was a poison that had seeped into every corner of the territory. "His men shot you, didn't they?" Josephine asked, though she already knew the answer. Dakota nodded grimly. "They mistook me for a deer at dusk. Then they saw I was not. They are poor trackers." "They're not here for you," Josephine said, her voice tight. "They're here for me." She grabbed the Colt from the table, her knuckles white. "He will want to come inside, nah," Dakota said, his eyes scanning the small cabin, assessing every weakness. "He will smell the blood, the whiskey." "I cleaned it up as best I could," she whispered, a knot of panic tightening in her throat. "You cannot clean a smell from the air so quickly," he countered. He looked at his discarded, blood-soaked shirt, then at the pallet he lay on. "Hide these, under the floorboards, quickly." Josephine pried up the loose board beneath her bed, where she kept a few precious things, shoving the bloody evidence of the night before into the dark space. "My wound," he said, touching the fresh white bandage. "What about it?" "Cover it with mud. It must look old, like a poultice for a fever." She understood immediately. She scooped a handful of cool ash and dirt from the edge of the hearth, mixed it with a little water from the bucket, and smeared the dark paste over the clean bandage. It now looked like a crude, days-old remedy for a sickness, not a fresh dressing for a gunshot. A sharp rap on the door made them both freeze. "Mrs. Adler, you in there?" Just checking on you after that blow." It was Kane's voice, thick with a friendliness that was more menacing than any threat. Josephine took a deep, shaky breath, forcing her face into a mask of weary annoyance. She glanced at Dakota. He had slumped back onto the pallet, his eyes half closed, his breathing deliberately shallow and ragged. He looked like a man on death's door. She opened the door a crack. Jedediah Kane was a big man, his bulk spilling over his saddle. His face was a map of broken veins, and his small, piggish eyes missed nothing. His foreman Silas sat beside him, a cruel sneer permanently etched on his face. "Mr. Kane," Josephine said, her voice cool, "as you can see, the storm didn't carry me away." "Just being neighborly, ma'am," Kane boomed, swinging down from his horse. His boots squelched in the mud as he strode toward the door. "Mind if I come in for a moment? A man could use a cup of coffee to wash the chill from his bones." He didn't wait for an answer. He pushed his way right past her into the cabin. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail before they landed on the pallet by the fire. "Who's this?" he asked, all the fake friendliness gone from his voice. "A sick traveler," Josephine said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He stumbled in last night, half dead from lung fever. I couldn't turn him out in the storm." Kane walked closer, his shadow falling over Dakota. Silas followed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Kane stared down at the Apache, his lip curling in disgust. "An Indian. A sick man," Josephine corrected, stepping between them. Kane ignored her. He nudged Dakota's shoulder with the toe of his boot. "Hey, you. What's your name?" Dakota coughed weakly, a dry, rasping sound. He didn't open his eyes. Silas snickered. "Looks like he's about to cash in his chips, boss. Stinks of sickness in here." Kane's eyes narrowed, scanning the room again. They stopped on the table, on the nearly empty bottle of whiskey Josephine had used to clean the wound. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. "Lung fever must be powerful, thirsty work," Kane said, his gaze flicking back to Josephine. "You always this generous with your whiskey to sick redskins?" "A fever needs to be burned out," Josephine said smoothly, her mind racing. "My grandmother's remedy." Kane grunted, but his eyes were still sharp with suspicion. "Funny thing," he said casually. "Me and the boys were tracking a buck yesterday evening, over by the ridge. Took a shot at it, but it got away. Wounded, I expect. You haven't seen any sign of it, have you?" It was a test. Josephine felt Dakota tense behind her, a tiny, imperceptible shift of weight. "The only thing I've been concerned with is my roof staying on, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "I have no time for tracking wounded animals." Kane stared at her for a long, hard moment, his little eyes trying to find a crack in her calm facade. She met his gaze without flinching. Her terror was a cold, hard knot in her gut, but she would die before she let him see it. This was her home. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. "Well," he said, turning for the door, "you let us know if your guest gets any worse. Wouldn't want any trouble out here." The threat was clear. He and Silas strode out. Josephine watched them mount their horses and ride away, not letting herself breathe until they were just small specks in the distance. Only then did she shut the door, her knees suddenly feeling like they wouldn't hold her up. She leaned against the solid wood, her eyes closed. "They know," she whispered. "He didn't believe me." "No," Dakota's voice came from behind her, strong and clear, cutting through her fear. "He does not know, but he suspects. A vulture does not need to see death to begin circling. It only needs the smell of it." He was sitting up again, wiping the mud paste from his bandage. His eyes were hard as obsidian. "He will be back." The days that followed were a quiet, simmering war. The sky was a vast, empty blue, and the land dried under the relentless Arizona sun. But the peace was a lie. Every shadow seemed to hold a spy. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of returning riders. Inside the cabin, an uneasy truce grew into a strange kind of routine. Dakota healed with the steady resilience of a desert plant. He spoke little, but his eyes followed Josephine everywhere, watching her mend clothes, cook meals, feed the chickens. It was an unnerving, constant assessment. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with everything they couldn't say. One evening, Josephine was cleaning Thomas's rifle, a ritual that brought her a small comfort. "Your hands know that weapon," Dakota observed from his pallet. "My husband taught me," she replied, not looking up. "He said a woman alone in this territory needed to be more dangerous than she looked. He was a wise man." A lump formed in Josephine's throat. He was. A good man. She paused, the memory of Thomas a sharp, sudden pain. "Cain's men are the reason he's dead." Dakota's gaze sharpened. "They shot him?" "No, nothing so direct." She set the rifle down, her hands needing to be still. "They ran off our horses last spring. All of them. Thomas rode for 2 days straight, tracking them without water. He found them. But he'd pushed himself too hard. He caught a fever on the ride back. It got in his lungs. He was never strong again after that." Her voice cracked on the last words. "He just faded. Cain wanted our land, and he knew how to break the man who worked it." She didn't know why she was telling him this. It was a private grief, a wound she'd never shown anyone. But in the quiet of the cabin, with this dangerous stranger who was now her only ally, the story just spilled out. Dakota was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I also know the work of men like Cain." He shifted, turning his shoulder to the firelight. A web of old scars, pale and puckered against his dark skin, covered his back and shoulder. They weren't the clean, straight lines of ceremonial scars. They were the chaotic, ugly marks of pure violence. "My village was on the San Carlos Reservation," he said, his voice flat, as if he were reciting a history that belonged to someone else. "They called it Hell's 40 Acres. The agent sold our rations and gave us rotten meat. My father spoke against him. He was a proud man. Too proud." He traced a long, thin scar on his forearm. "Soldiers came. They said my father was inciting a riot. They took him, and my mother, and my little sister. I was hunting. When I returned, the village was burning." He stopped, his jaw working silently. He didn't need to say more. Josephine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The brutal, casual cruelty of the story was horrifying. She looked at him, at the scars she could see, and the countless others she could not. And for the first time, she didn't see an Apache warrior, a fearsome other. She saw a man who had lost everything, just like her. Their grief came from different worlds, but it spoke the same language. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words felt small and useless. He looked at her then, and his eyes weren't hard or fierce. They were filled with an ancient, bottomless sorrow. "Sorrow is a poor shield," he said. "It must be forged into something else." From that night on, something changed. He began to teach her, not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to read the land, to see the signs she had always missed. A bent twig meant a deer had passed. A disturbed pattern of stones meant a man on horseback. He taught her to listen, not just with her ears, but with her whole body, to feel the vibrations in the earth, to notice the sudden silence of the birds that signaled a predator's approach. He was teaching her how to survive. In turn, she tended his wound. She read to him sometimes in the evenings, from the only book she owned, a worn copy of the Bible, her voice a soft murmur against the vast silence of the night. He would listen without comment, his expression unreadable. They were two solitary people, a white woman and an Apache man, trapped together at the edge of the world, surrounded by enemies, haunted by ghosts. The scars they carried, both visible and hidden, were no longer barriers between them. They were the common ground on which a fragile, desperate alliance was being built. And in the process, Josephine's grief began to feel different. It was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it had a new edge. It was hardening. It was being forged into something else entirely. Dakota's strength returned quickly. Soon he was walking, first with a limp around the cabin, then venturing outside, his movements becoming fluid and silent again. He seemed to be a part of the landscape, his buckskin blending with the muted colors of the rock and dust. He began to hunt, leaving at dawn and returning with a rabbit or a quail, a silent offering he would leave on the cabin steps. Their unspoken routine was comfortable, but Josephine knew it was the calm before the storm. Cain's shadow still loomed. His riders were seen more often, always at a distance, just watching, waiting. "He wants the land," Josephine said one afternoon, her eyes fixed on two riders on a distant ridge. "But I don't understand why he wants this piece so badly. The grazing is poor. The soil is rocky." Dakota followed her gaze. "White men often want things for reasons that make no sense. They want to own the sunset." "It's more than that," she insisted. "Thomas always said this land had a secret. He was always digging, prospecting up in the canyon behind the cabin. He never told me what he was looking for." Dakota's interest was piqued. He looked toward the narrow, winding canyon that cut into the foothills of the Dragoons. "Show me." They walked together, Josephine leading the way up the familiar path, Dakota following with that unnervingly quiet tread. The canyon was a place of deep shadows and towering rock walls. "He spent most of his time here," she said, gesturing to a small caved-in area that looked like a rudimentary mine entrance. "He thought there might be silver." But Dakota wasn't looking at the mine. His attention was on the rock face beside it. He ran his hand over the stone, his brow furrowed. He walked along the base of the canyon wall, stopping every few feet, touching the rock, observing the pattern of the vegetation. "Your husband was digging in the wrong place," he said finally. He pointed to a thick patch of cattails and willows, growing in a place they had no right to be, far from any visible creek bed. "Life does not lie," he said. "Where these grow, there is water. Not on the surface. Below." He led her to the spot. Pushing aside the brush, he began to clear away the loose rock and soil at the base of the cliff. Josephine watched for a moment, then joined in, her curiosity overriding her skepticism. They dug for nearly an hour, their hands raw, until Dakota's fingers hit something smooth and flat. It was a capstone, expertly fitted into the rock. With a shared grunt of effort, they pried it loose. A rush of cool, damp air breathed out from the darkness below. Dakota lit a piece of dry brush as a torch and lowered it into the opening. The torchlight flickered on the surface of a deep, clear pool of water. It wasn't a trickle or a muddy seep. It was a spring, a hidden river, flowing silently beneath the rock. Josephine stared, speechless. In a land where water was more precious than gold, this was a king's ransom. A permanent water source like this could sustain a herd of 1,000 cattle through the driest season. It could turn this dusty homestead into the heart of a cattle empire. "This is the secret," she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "This is what Cain wants. He must have found out somehow." "A man like Cain does not find things by accident," Dakota said, his voice grim. "Someone told him. Perhaps the same man who sold your husband the land." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. They had been set up from the start. Thomas had been sold a dream, while Cain was just waiting for him to fail or die so he could swoop in and take the prize. The thought filled Josephine with a cold, hard rage that burned away the last of her grief. This wasn't just land anymore. It was Thomas's legacy. It was her future, and Cain was trying to steal it. "He can't have it," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I will poison that spring before I let him have it." Dakota looked from the water to her face, which was set with a grim determination he recognized. He saw the sorrow in her finally forged into a weapon. "Then we must prepare," he said. "He will not wait much longer. Now that he knows you are not alone, he will not try to scare you away. He will come to wipe the slate clean." But as they replaced the capstone, Dakota's hand brushed against something carved into the rock just inside the opening. He pulled the torch closer. They weren't just scratches. They were symbols. Faint, but unmistakable. Old Spanish markings. And next to them, something else. A crude map etched into the stone, pointing deeper into the canyon. Thomas hadn't just found water. He had found something else. And suddenly Josephine had a terrifying thought. Maybe the water wasn't the secret. Maybe it was just the key. The flour sack was almost empty. The coffee was gone. It was a simple problem, but in their situation, it was a crisis. Fortifications couldn't fill an empty stomach. The only place to get supplies was Purgatory Creek. "I have to go," Josephine announced, her voice tight with reluctance. "We're out of everything." Dakota stood by the window, a silent silhouette against the harsh light. It is a trap. It's a general store, Dakota, not a battlefield. Kane owns that town, he stated, his voice flat. The store owner, the blacksmith, the sheriff, they are all his men. He will know you are there within 5 minutes. I'll be quick, in and out. What other choice do we have? She argued. He turned to face her, his expression grim. The choice is to be hungry. Hunger is better than a bullet. But Josephine's stubborn streak, the same one that kept her on this land after Thomas died, flared up. I'm not going to let him starve me out of my own home. Napoleon is fast. I can do this. Dakota saw the resolve in her eyes and knew he couldn't stop her. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. Ride with the sun at your back. Stay off the main road as long as you can. And trust no one, especially the man with the badge. The ride to Purgatory Creek was a long, tense wire. Every rock seemed to hide a threat. Josephine kept her horse, Napoleon, to a steady canter, her senses on high alert, just as Dakota had taught her. The sudden silence of the birds, the unnatural stillness in the air. She noticed it all now. The town was a single dusty street lined with tired-looking wooden buildings. As she rode in, she felt eyes on her from the saloon porch, from the dark maw of the blacksmith shop. The whispers followed her like flies. She was the widow Adler, the woman who, rumor had it, was harboring an Apache. Inside the general store, the air was thick with a hostility you could taste. Henderson, the proprietor, who had always been kind to her in Thomas, now barely met her eyes. He filled her order with a sullen slowness, his hands fumbling with the sacks of flour and beans. Just as she was paying, the door swung open, and Sheriff Brody filled the frame. He was a tall, stooped man with a drooping mustache and pale, watery eyes. "Well now, Josephine," he said, his voice a folksy drawl. "Good to see you. Haven't seen you in town since. Well, since Thomas passed. My condolences again." "Sheriff," she nodded, her hand hovering near the purse where she kept a small derringer. "Heard some talk you might be having some trouble out your way," Brody continued, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Jedediah Kane mentioned he was worried about you." "I'm managing just fine, Sheriff." "Is that so?" His eyes drifted past her, out the window. "Because I also hear tell you've taken in a guest. A sick man," Kane said. "An Apache." The store went silent. Henderson froze, his hand halfway to a tin of peaches. Josephine's blood ran cold. "I offered shelter to a man caught in the storm, Sheriff. It was the Christian thing to do." Of course," Brody said, his tone placating, but his eyes hard. "But folks are jumpy, Josephine. Seeing an Apache so close to town, it makes people nervous. For your own safety, it might be best if my deputy and I rode out and escorted him back to the reservation." It was a trap, plain and simple. They would come to her cabin, see Dakota's healing wound, and have all the proof they needed that she was helping a fugitive warrior, not a sick traveler. They would kill him and seize her land. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice like ice. "He's already gone. Left 2 days ago, once his fever broke." The lie felt heavy and clumsy in her mouth. She prayed it was enough. Sheriff Brody stroked his mustache, his eyes narrowed. "Is that a fact? Funny. One of Kane's boys swore he saw smoke from your chimney just this morning." "I like a fire in the morning," she snapped back. "It gets cold." She threw the coins on the counter, grabbed her sacks, and walked out of the store, feeling the sheriff's gaze burning into her back. She loaded the supplies onto Napoleon as quickly as she could, her hands shaking with rage and fear. She had to get out of there. As she swung into the saddle, she saw him, Silas, Kane's foreman, emerging from the saloon across the street. He looked at Sheriff Brody, who was now standing in the doorway of the store. Silas gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The betrayal was complete. The law in Purgatory Creek was just Jedediah Kane's private army. She spurred Napoleon into a gallop, not caring about the road, just needing to put distance between herself and that corrupted town. She didn't look back, but she could feel them. She knew they would be coming. Her trip for flour and coffee had just signed a death warrant, theirs or hers. When she finally reached the homestead, sliding from Napoleon's lathered back, Dakota was there. He took one look at her pale, grim face and knew. How long do we have? He asked. Not long, she panted, pulling the rifle from its scabbard. I saw Silas signal the sheriff. They know I was lying. They're coming. Dakota nodded, his face a mask of grim resolve. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. Then let them come, he said. They will find we are not hungry, and we are not afraid. But as she rushed inside to load the shotgun, she saw the bullet she'd pulled from Dakota's side, still sitting on the mantelpiece where she'd left it. She picked it up. It wasn't a plain lead ball. Carved into its side was a tiny, distinct shape, the brand of Jedediah Cain, a C inside a circle. And looking at it, she realized something else. She'd seen that mark before, long ago, scrawled in Thomas's journal, next to a frantic entry about the man who'd sold them the land. Cain hadn't just been waiting for Thomas to die. He had orchestrated the entire thing, from the very beginning. The sunset bled across the sky, and with the fading light came the riders, 7 of them, dark shapes moving against the twilight. They didn't ride in boldly. They fanned out, using the terrain for cover, cautious, professional. This wasn't a posse of angry townsfolk. This was a squad of hired killers. 4 will come from the front to draw our fire, Dakota said, his voice a low whisper from his position, nestled among the rocks above the cabin. He had Thomas's rifle. 3 will circle around through the canyon to come at us from behind. They think the woman will be inside, panicking. I'm not panicking, Josephine said, her voice tight but steady. She was crouched behind the low rock wall they had built, the Colt Peacemaker heavy in her hands. Her shotgun, loaded with buckshot, lay beside her. I know, Dakota said, and the simple affirmation settled her nerves like a sip of whiskey. When the shooting starts, do not fire at the 4 in front. Wait for the 3 at your back. They will think you are a sheep. Show them the wolf. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of Josephine's own heart. Then the first shot rang out. A bullet splintered the wood of the cabin's door frame. It was followed by a volley from the 4 men in front. They were shooting at the cabin, expecting return fire from the windows. Josephine flattened herself against the ground, her knuckles white on the grip of the Colt. She didn't move. She listened as Dakota had taught her. She listened for the sounds that weren't there, the silence behind her. From his perch, Dakota was patient. He watched the 4 men below, watched Silas directing them. They were confident, careless. He waited for the sun to be fully gone, for that moment between light and dark when the eye is most easily deceived. He raised the rifle, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. One of the riders below crumpled. A cry of surprise cut short. Before the others could react, Dakota worked the lever action. Crack. A second man fell, clutching his leg and screaming. Silas roared a curse, firing wildly up at Dakota's position. He's up in the rocks! Get him! The remaining 2 men laid down a hail of fire, bullets ricocheting off the boulders around Dakota. It was the diversion he needed. At that exact moment, Josephine heard it, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel just behind the cabin. They were here, 3 men creeping up, rifles at the ready. They thought she was trapped inside, terrified. She rose from behind the wall like a ghost. The first man, not 10 feet from her, saw her at the last second. His eyes went wide with shock. He didn't even have time to raise his rifle. Josephine fired the shotgun. The blast was deafening. The man was thrown backward as if he'd been hit by a train. The other 2 spun around, surprised, disoriented. Josephine dropped the shotgun and brought the Peacemaker up, firing twice in quick succession. Her hands were steady. Her aim was true. Thomas had made her practice until she could hit a tin can at 30 paces without thinking. These men were much larger than tin cans. The second man grunted and fell. The third got off a single wild shot that whizzed past her head before he collapsed, clutching his chest. It was over in less than 10 seconds. 3 men were dead or dying in her yard. The sudden, brutal violence of it made her stomach churn. But there was no time for sickness. The shooting from the front of the house stopped. Silas and his 1 remaining man had heard the shotgun blast and the pistol shots. They knew their plan had failed, catastrophically. What in the hell was that? The remaining gunman yelled, his voice laced with panic. It's the woman! Silas roared in disbelief and rage. "The witch is armed!" There was a moment of frantic, cursed debate, then the sound of two horses scrambling away in a panicked retreat. They were running. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the groans of the man Dakota had shot in the leg. The sharp smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Josephine stood over the men she had shot, her pistol still smoking. Her hands were shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She had just killed 3 men. The reality of it was a physical shock, but underneath the horror was a hard, diamond-bright core of satisfaction. They had come to kill her, to take her home, and she had won. Dakota scrambled down from the rocks, moving quickly. He saw the bodies and then he looked at Josephine. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fierce triumph. He walked over to her. He didn't touch her. He just gently took the warm pistol from her unresisting fingers. He uncocked the hammer and holstered it for her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, a profound and unspoken truth passed between them. She was not a widow to be protected. She was a warrior. And in the bloody devil's arithmetic of the West, they were now equals. But as she looked down at the face of one of the men she'd shot, she saw something that made her blood run cold again. He wasn't one of the rough-looking gunslingers she'd seen with Cain before. His face was younger, cleaner, and pinned to the inside of his jacket, she saw the glint of a badge. A U.S. Marshal's badge. Cain hadn't just brought hired guns. He had brought the law. The dawn revealed the horrifying truth. Their victory was just a reprieve. The bodies in the yard weren't just a promise of Cain's vengeance. They were proof of his power. He could bring U.S. Marshals to do his dirty work. They were no longer just defending property. They were fugitives who had killed a federal officer. "We can't stay," Josephine stated, the cold reality settling in her bones. "No," Dakota agreed. His gaze was fixed on the narrow canyon behind the cabin, the same canyon that held the spring, the same canyon with the map carved in its wall. "We will not fight in the open. We will not run. We will make the canyon his tomb." The plan was a final, desperate gamble. They took only ammunition, water, and Thomas's old journal, abandoning the homestead and leading their horses deep into the winding stone passage. They found the spot marked on the rock-carved map, a hidden ledge high above the canyon floor, accessible only by a treacherous, narrow path. It was a perfect sniper's nest. From there they watched and they waited. By midday, Cain arrived. He didn't bring 7 men this time. He brought a dozen, their faces grim and determined. He had the corrupt Sheriff Brody with him, and at the head of the column rode Silas, his face a thundercloud of rage. When Cain saw his dead men, including the marshal, in the empty cabin, his caution was consumed by fury. He roared an order, and a torch was thrown onto the roof of the small cabin. Josephine watched in silence as her home, the last physical piece of her life with Thomas, was engulfed in a funeral pyre of black smoke. The fire didn't hurt as much as she thought it would. That life was already gone. Seeing the tracks leading into the canyon, Cain and his men plunged in after them, blind with arrogance, seeking cornered prey. As the last rider entered the narrowest part of the passage, Dakota cut a rope he had painstakingly set in place. A cascade of rock and timber they had spent hours positioning thundered down, sealing the canyon mouth. They were trapped. From their protected perch, Josephine and Dakota unleashed hell. Dakota's rifle cracked with lethal precision. Josephine's shotgun, which she reloaded with a calm efficiency that surprised even herself, sent curtains of buckshot tearing through the panicked cluster of men and horses below. The high canyon walls turned 2 guns into 20, the echoes creating a maelstrom of deadly unseen fire. It was a slaughter. Men screamed and fell, their wild shots ricocheting harmlessly off the stone. Horses panicked, trampling the wounded. In minutes, only Jedediah Cain and Silas were left, crouched behind dead horses, their private army destroyed around them. Cain rose, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury, screaming Josephine's name into the echoing canyon. "Woman, face me!" Josephine's voice answered from the heights, cold and clear as the water hidden below. "You wanted my land, Cain. Come and get it." He charged forward blindly, firing his pistol at the empty rocks. A single crack from Dakota's rifle answered. Kane stumbled, a look of surprise on his face, and then collapsed into the dust. The beast was silenced, but Silas was still there. He scrambled from behind his cover and made a run for the back of the canyon, trying to escape. Josephine didn't hesitate. She took aim with the rifle just as Thomas had taught her. She saw Silas's face, the cruel sneer that had haunted her for months. She thought of Thomas, wasting away from a fever Kane's men had given him. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. A profound quiet descended. They climbed down into the canyon, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. There was no triumph in the sight, only the grim, bloody cost of survival. They walked out of that stone tomb, past the smoldering ruins of the cabin, and stood looking at the scarred land. "What will you do now?" Dakota asked quietly. Josephine looked at the black ruin of her home, but her gaze was fixed on the horizon beyond. "I will rebuild," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised even her. "The spring is still there. The land is mine." She turned to him. "And you?" He looked toward the Dragoon Mountains, a silhouette of longing against the sky. "My people are scattered. I will try to find them." Their paths, joined by violence, had now reached their end. He mounted his horse, his face unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, profound respect. "Josephine Adler," he said the name, like a prayer. "You are a woman of great spirit. Do not let this land break it." "Dakota," she replied softly, "may you find your peace." With a final nod, he turned and rode east, a lone figure merging with the vast landscape. Josephine watched him go. Then she opened the smoke-stained journal she'd saved from the fire. She found the entry about the land deal, about the man with the C brand who sold it to them. Thomas had written, "He talks of silver and gold, but his eyes are fixed on something else, something he thinks I don't see. The water is life. It is the real treasure." Thomas had known all along. He wasn't a fool chasing a dream. He was a visionary, and he had been murdered for it. Josephine Adler remained. She rebuilt her home, not the small cabin it was, but a ranch house, stronger and more defiant than before. The spring, her secret well of life, allowed her to build the future her husband had only dreamed of. Her name was never written into the official histories of the territory, but her story, like so many others, became a part of the land itself. A tale whispered on the wind, a testament to the fact that true strength isn't about the battles you win, but the resilience to stand on the ashes of your old life and have the courage to build anew. Hers is a story of how the most unlikely alliances are forged in the hottest fires, and how even in the most brutal of times, the human spirit, when pushed, will not only survive, it will prevail. If this story of grit, survival, and the untold heroes of the West resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale that goes beyond the simple legends. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Real, raw, and unforgettable tales from the heart of history. Let us know in the comments which part of Josephine's journey moved you the most. Thank you for listening.